Okay, everyone, if I could ask you all again to take your seats, please. We do know, of course, that today is all about networking as well, and we have made sure that there's plenty of breaks baked into our occasion, so we'll make sure to do that. So first things first is, can I ask you, I'm going to run through a couple of questions again on Mentimeter, so if I could ask the team to please pull it up here behind me on screen. So this is, oh, a lot of you are there already. Very good. So can I ask you first of all, how important do you think Ireland's new MPA legislation will be at addressing biodiversity loss at sea? So this is the first one that okay, right, we're getting a pretty strong and solid consensus here. We have 52 answers, 59, and so far, it's now 10-1. My degree was financial maths and economics, so that's why the calculator is working away here. So critically important, we've so far had 68 responses and 9 of you saying somewhat. Okay, we now have a 7-to-10 ratio between critically and somewhat important, whereas we can see here that there's nobody that has picked not important. Okay, very clear answer to that one. Now, this is the next one. Up to 10% of Ireland's MPAs should be fully protected where no damaging human activities occur. And if I'm correct, this was exactly what we heard Karen say this morning. Now, of that, we have given 2 ends of a scale, strongly disagree or strongly agree. And we have 57 answers to that, so 60, 66, 67, okay, we're heading for 70. So where it looks like we're landing on that is on a scale of 1 to 5. It looks like where we're landing on that one is 4.5 out of 5 in favour of strongly agree. Okay, and of course the reason that we're doing this is number 1 to get a sense of where you're coming from, but number 2, these are the points that I want to put to our speakers during our panel discussion throughout. Okay, the next one. What kind of change is needed to deliver effective MPAs from how we currently care for our protected sites at sea? Transformational, incremental, collaborative, or no change? So what kind of change? Bearing in mind that our second panel discussion today is all around delivering transformational change. So it is to this particular panel that I'm interested to see. So we have 32 for transformational, 4 for incremental, 5, 61 for collaborative, and nobody so far is saying no change. Okay. Okay, again, a pretty decisive result there. It looks like a 3-to-2 ratio with collaborative and transformational. Certainly it sounds like that the team at Fair Seas Ireland certainly have got the correct title for our second panel discussion today. Okay, and we can take Menti off now. I've now moved it on to the screen where the Q&A is. We had 13 questions for Dr. Rashid, so we will ask for your continued interaction. I will have more time to ask your questions to the panel when we have them later on today. So, earlier on this morning, in essence, to give you a summary of where we're at, indeed, as I say, Karen did speak about the importance of that 10% strictly or fully protected area, where our Lord Mayor talked about the fact that Cork is the largest natural harbour in all of the Northern Hemisphere, and water is a key part of our makeup in Cork. Of course, Ireland is one of the largest maritime territories in Europe with 880,000 square kilometres. And on that note, Dr. Rashid spoke about potentially calling Ireland an ocean state. He said that anything can be solved when it comes to policy, people and technology, and the Venn diagram sits right in the middle. He spoke about Infinity Fish, the name of his book, and he said we should abandon the notion of everything all at once at the one time. He said not all at once leads to intergenerational justice. He said not everything leads to biodiversity justice, and not all at the same time means that future generations isn't just left with the jellyfish. So on that note, I'm now going to invite Minister Malcolm Noonan, Minister of State at the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, to now make a formal address at this conference. Minister, the floor is yours.
Dí Vermagin agus is mór an honour of living in Damascus nu ar an law on down. It's a great privilege to be with you here in Cork to celebrate World Ocean Day today. And I'm really delighted as well that this event has brought people from all around the world, from Norway, from the US and even from the Galapagos. I think it's just fantastic. I want to thank Fair Seas for organising it. It's really very special and timely that we're here this morning. I want to say hello to my colleague Grace Sullivan, who's been a true eco-warrior and for marine conservation for many, many decades. And again, just great to be here with you. And I just think as well we couldn't have chosen a better venue to highlight the challenges and benefits of protecting the marine environment. And on behalf of the Irish Government, I wish you all a warm welcome. While you were here, just take a look around, and in Cork, just metres away from where we all sit on the banks of the Lee, you can find striking examples of biodiversity right here in the heart of Cork City. And with its busy port and its bustling streets, the relationship between humans and nature is playing out as it has done for over 1,000 years here in our second largest city. Grey seals inhabit the estuarine channels behind you. Otters make home for their young here. Atlantic salmon swim past the building, which you now sit on migration voyages to and from the ocean. And these all serve as a reminder of the value of marine biodiversity and its vulnerability to the impacts of our activities. However, the science is clear. The triple crisis of biodiversity loss, of climate change and pollution are the existential threats of our time. There is only one ocean, and there's an urgent need for action at all scales, globally, regionally, nationally, and importantly, locally. Disturbances caused by human activities through overharvesting, excessive nutrient inputs, and human-made noise can directly cause the loss to marine biodiversity. Our climate, too, is changing. As our cool, oxygen-rich waters begin to warm, the habitats that have enabled salmon and other creatures to survive and thrive in our waters will begin to decline. Pollution from industrial and domestic sources, including plastic pollution, is degrading our ecosystems. Ireland is committed to take action to protect and restore our ocean through the work both at home and abroad, and our progress is accelerating. In December last year, at the COP15 in Montreal, the world agreed that the 30 by 30 target for marine protected areas, and this commitment is also reflected in our national programme for government. At that meeting, I announced a major expansion of Ireland's Natura network, with the designation of 2 new special areas of conservation in the marine, and these sites totalling 3 million hectares were designated for deepwater reef habitat, a unique ecosystem that supports a wide range of marine species and communities. Ireland's protected areas under the Birds and Habitats Directive has now tripled from just over 2% in 2020 to cover more than 8% of our marine waters and seabed, with further expansion planned in the very near future. In March of this year, my department played its role in the successful UN negotiations in New York on the Treaty to Protect Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And I want to thank our team for the work that they took part and participated in that. And this is a groundbreaking step towards biodiversity protection in the global ocean. At the regional level, in the Northeast Atlantic, Ireland has been a leader in the protection of biodiversity, playing an instrumental role in the delivery of the North Atlantic Current and Ivanhoe Sea Basin Marine Protected Area in 2021. And this high seas MPA at 600,000 kilometres square has approximately the size, which is approximately the size of France, is a critical site for seabirds across the whole Atlantic. While these international and regional successes are significant achievements and a cause for great hope, there's no doubt in my mind that we still have much to do when it comes to the protection of our coastal and marine environment. Improved regulation of marine activity is one aspect of protecting our seas, and as Ireland seeks to increase its supply of marine renewable energy, the new Maritime Area Regulatory Authority, or MARA, will play a critical role in assigning consent applications, granting licences and ensuring robust compliance with environmental standards through enforcement measures. It's fantastic to meet Mark Mellett here, who's in that up, and Mark, no better person to lead that. We're delighted you're in that post. However, reversing the decline of marine biodiversity will require more than environmental standards and compliance. The government's and my own ambitions are high. We know that there are elements of our extensive marine environment that are poorly understood or are not in good state and that need attention, greater understanding and greater action. Until now, most of our progress nationally towards spatial protection of the marine environment has been through implementation of the EU Birds and Habitats directives. Protection of the marine environment must go beyond these species and habitats prescribed in EU law. And to achieve this, Ireland is in the final stages of developing modern new primary legislation for the designation and effective management of national marine protected areas. Following the government's approval of the publication of the General Scheme of the Marine Protected Areas Bill last December, my officials have been working with the Office of the Parliamentary Council to develop the full text of the draft bill, along with Minister Darragh O'Brien, we hope to bring to Cabinet before the summer recess, and we're on track to do that. The bill will work in parallel with existing legislation for the conservation of our marine environment and its resources, and with all this legislation for the sustainable planning and management of activities in the Irish maritime area. It sets out to protect a wide variety of species and habitats and other marine ecosystems features that are not currently protected, as well as enabling spatial protection for socially and culturally important features of our vast marine area. And the new bill will not only broaden the protection for species and habitats, but will also allow us to focus on ecosystems that play particularly important roles in climate regulation. Furthermore, it will be based on the principles of ecosystem-based management, with public participation at its core. This means protecting the marine environment and ensuring the sustainable use of which is everybody's responsibility, and that everyone has a role to play. And it's interesting to see the findings of your survey in the hall here this morning. I think it plays out to what we're trying to achieve as well. The value of the ocean is something that all of us here today can recognise. And whether for our livelihoods, our identity, or for its beauty and biodiversity values, we all have a role in the stewardship and the protection of this shared public resource. The draft MPA bill will include the provision for an ocean environment policy statement. Among other things, this will set out our vision for cooperation at home and abroad and how best to work together to protect our shared ocean. The statement will also set out Ireland's priorities for protection and effective management of marine protected areas in our coastal and our offshore waters. The new bill will establish a Marine Protected Area Advisory Body made up of experts across a range of disciplines and interests, and this body will provide the scientific expertise needed to identify sensitive and vulnerable areas suitable for designation. An ecology-oriented subset of the MPA Advisory Group of 2020 has already been convened on an administrative basis and has just finalised a report identifying sensitive areas for biodiversity in the Irish Sea, and I aim to publish this in coming weeks. Similar to their work, the future MPA advisory body will build its knowledge base on the best available scientific evidence and identify areas where the new data and information is needed. In response to resounding demand, the draft MPA bill will put in place structures for a comprehensive and meaningful process of public participation through all stages of identification, designation and management of new MPAs. And this is something that was hugely important to me as we travel the country listening to fishers and other stakeholders when we're engaged in the public participation process around the expert advisory group report. And I was speaking to Tim O'Higgins, who's leading the drafting of the MPA legislation just during the break there. And it has been challenging for the drafters because it's something novel to build in this public participation piece. But I believe it's absolutely vital to what we're trying to achieve. Ultimately, in Ireland, achieving the goal of protecting 30% of our maritime area by 2030 will be a matter of societal choice. Based on a foundation of scientific information, the Irish public will be the central voices in deciding what to protect and how to protect it. This is a new way of working for all of us, and it goes beyond what we've attempted before, but it is essential if we are to succeed in protecting our precious marine environment. Put simply, we must work together and everybody has a role to play. The main message for me about marine protected areas is that participation benefits biodiversity. And I listened to Dr. Rashid earlier and again in the Q&A, and you spoke very strongly about that, about public participation. So I do think it's critically important. And just to say as well that we are trialling universal basic income in this country, so it's interesting to see how that piece of work plays out. I think it's hugely exciting. Participation is essential to ensure that we make the best and most sustainable choices to protect and conserve Ireland's dynamic and rich marine environment, and all of the communities that rely on it and cherish it. There is simply no other way. Working together, we are fellow travellers in Ireland's exciting journey to address biodiversity loss in our seas and our ocean, to tackle climate change, to protect, conserve and to restore our marine environment. In many ways, it is a journey of pioneers as we look to overcome challenges, to balance so many interests, and to listen to so many voices along the way. Our destination in this journey is a brighter future for all, for our economy and for society, for nature and for climate, for people and the planet. Gur Magwith Galer.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Minister, and the indeed inspiring words. And it started off where you particularly pointed out the triple crisis that we face today with climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And what I think is interesting is what you mentioned about drafting the legislation is a challenge because of the novel element of community integration, and that is something that is going to come up a lot during our conversation today. But one of the things that I would quote the Minister on is saying that the 30-30 aim is a matter of societal choice. And of course, there's a lot in that statement. Who is society? Who is involved in that? Who doesn't feel involved in that? Who doesn't have a voice in that? And fundamentally, who is responsible for that? And it's all of those issues that we're really going to get into the heart of during our conversation today. So the way in which this next session is going to work is that we have 4 people. Each of them is going to present for 8 minutes. During that time, as I say, the Q&A is open, so you can submit any questions that you want. After that, we're going to bring everybody back up on stage, and I'm going to pose your questions to them in a panel discussion, and that's what's going to lead us right up until lunchtime. You have been a brilliant already participatory audience, whether it's on Mentimeter or on Instagram or on Twitter, etc. We're watching all of that, all of us, so please do keep that coming. But first of all, I am now going to invite Professor Mark Costello, who is joining us from Nord University in Norway, and he's going to start off with the first of our 8-minute presentations in this session called Healthy Seas, How Are We Faring? The floor is indeed yours, Professor Mark. Over to you.
Good. Do you get the cordia? So very pleased to be here, and my first slides are coming up. So my second, after you do that, yeah. Yeah. So I worked for the last 16 years in New Zealand, and the Maori do something that Cork people I learned to do as well, is you introduce your context and where you're coming from. So apart from being from County Kildare in Ireland, I did my PhD here in Cork at Lough Marine Reserve, the first marine reserve in Ireland, and still the first one. Hint, hint. But then when I went to New Zealand, I was really lucky to be located in the north of New Zealand by Goat Island, Lee, or it's also got an official name, which I won't bore you with, Marine Reserve. And that was set up just like Lough for research. And the reason was that the Marine Lab there thought, well, if they designate this as a Marine Reserve, nobody will come there and be able to do the research in peace. Well, that didn't work out because a little while later, they had hundreds of thousands of people coming to see the wondrous abundance of fish that recovered in the reserve within years of its being founded. So we should be wary of surprises. Other things that I've been involved in, I taught a course in marine protected areas there for 15 years, and I run a Facebook page on marine reserves where I post one item about MPAs every day. And I'm also now leading a project in Europe where we're going to map the optimal places for biodiversity in all of European exclusive economic zones, and including the high seas in the Mediterranean, and also where the largest carbon stores are in the sediments of that as well, because you don't want to release those carbon stores back into the atmosphere. So, as I mentioned at Lee Marine Reserve, the scientists weren't really very smart, maybe, or they thought the place was natural. And they thought that people won't come. And one of my best friends there, he came down one day with a fishing rod and he saw this big sign, no fishing. He never heard of this idea. No fishing? Where? And there's still people that can't understand why they can't go fishing. And now he's the greatest champion in marine reserves because he saw what happened afterwards. He became an underwater photographer. They also speculated that fish would lose their fear of people, which is true, which means when you go swimming there, it's kind of a bit disturbing. You see a fish that's bigger than your children swimming right beside them, and its jaws are about like this size, so but people love it. And so the public flocked there, which creates tourism pressure, so that's a kind of a good thing, I suppose. It's a problem that you'd like to have. And now there's 44 fully protected marine reserves in New Zealand, most of them because local communities went to Lee, they saw this is fantastic, let's have one too. My friend Bill Ballantyne, who championed this one, used to say they're like chocolates, you get one and you want more. So the first chocolate was Lee. But of course, not all of them are accessible to the public, and they all vary in their location. And we also discovered this trophic cascade, which has since been found to happen all over the world. When you take away the top predators in an area, the sea urchins seem to proliferate, they eat all the seaweed, and you end up with these urchin barrens. And at the time, they didn't have that name. But it took over 20 years for the scientists in New Zealand to actually agree that, okay, yeah, things were not quite natural in the 70s, and that we've shown that with the recovery of the lobsters, or crayfish in this case, and the large snapper, they eat the urchin population decreases and the kelp forest returns. And this has happened all over the place. So this is kind of a general pattern. And it's probably happened all over Europe, but we don't really know because we've hardly anywhere that's where you have no fishing. And it's very different when we take resources on land and sea, and I think this is often forgotten. In the sea, we take the top predators and the mid-level predators, but on land, we largely eat herbivores and plants. And this is a major effect in the ecosystem. It means even very little fishing will change the whole food web and the trophic level in the ecosystem. And we only know that if we have marine reserves or places where there's no fishing. And there's been lots of misunderstandings. So teaching the course, I taught a course, and we had marine reserve managers, people from Pacific, Southeast Asia. And it was really interesting that indigenous communities in the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia really get the idea of marine reserves. Well, of course, we've been doing that for generations. We've always had places with no fishing for different reasons, cultural reasons, and to protect their resources for future times. But these are some of the things that came up. So one of them is that people think protected areas are to protect species, but I'll show you that that doesn't seem to be actually the case. That it's radical, that only commercial fishing impacts biodiversity, so you kick out the big commercial fishermen, which seems a bit unfair to them, but that's a social decision. That they don't benefit the large, wide-ranging species, and that they're very expensive. And it's quite reasonable for people, and I think most of the public would say, if the area is called protected, well, then you don't go hunting and killing there. And that there are international categories for the International Union for Conservation of Nature defined protected areas, and you think that countries would follow those, and that all the biodiversity in the areas listed as protected in the World Database, which has entries from most countries of the world, that they're actually protected. But actually none of those things are true. So if we look on this graph here, we can see this is the number of marine protected areas over time. And the red ones are fully protected, and the black ones are partially protected. And you have no information on what partially protected means. It could be complete, no change whatsoever. In fact, some countries said, we're calling this a marine protected area, but there'll be no change to fishing whatsoever, which was the only thing that is impacting the areas. And you see this, back. You can see this gap is getting wider. So the gap between real protection and some sort of protection is actually getting wider. So I call this one of the cons in conservation. Yet there's a lot of pretending going on and talking about things. But often most disturbing is that 3/4 of coastal countries don't even have one place in their coastal area that you can't kill marine life. Ireland is included, so is Norway, where I live. Well, actually, Norway has a very small one, but not many people know about it when you're just one small community. So these are some of the cons, as I mentioned. Also, there's 7 categories of protected areas, but actually some of them are to protect landscapes or waterfalls or geological features, so they're not actually to protect biodiversity. And this is understandably quite confusing. And 94% of marine protected areas don't aim to protect biodiversity in the first place. So now we're down to the 6% that Rashid and others were talking about, and some of those are paper parks. So really, we've hardly made any attempt to protect marine life globally. And another one of the myths is that it's somehow radical to create areas in the sea where you don't allow people to take resources. But actually, this is quite common. There's a whole list of areas I list here. Pipelines, marinas, industrial areas, fish farms, you don't have the right to access them. They're essentially temporary or permanently private property. And I wonder how much of that area has already been set aside. But you notice that these are all for commercial or private benefits. And there's very little set aside for nature. You'd think that we could set aside 10% for nature and then set aside the other parts for different human uses. And there's also evidence going back even to hundreds and thousands of years that human populations impacted fisheries in the Mediterranean, in Africa, and other countries. So even a little bit of fishing, because it usually removes the top fish, as Rashid mentioned, it changes the whole ecosystem, and some species have actually considered to have gone extinct locally due to these fishing pressures. And pelagic species also benefit. One of the largest MPAs that's fully protected in the world was set up by George Bush, I think, the American president, off Hawaii. And this is a slide from the paper. And this is the protected areas, the blue lines, and the different colored blue lines are different distances from the protected area. And in the graphs on the right, they've got 100 nautical mile, 200 and 300 nautical mile trends. And the further you go, the lines show the number of tuna in the outside these areas here, and the tuna populations increased outside the marine protected area after the fishing. And that's because the tuna, as Rashid mentioned, don't stay still. They will increase in abundance in the protected area, but they will also spill over to the areas outside of it, so the fisheries benefit. And this pattern is well known for demersal and reef-living fish species, but pelagic species, it's a bit harder to measure. And in a review that we have in progress at the moment, we reviewed the literature. We found 44 studies where they looked at the economic effects of marine protected areas. We couldn't find one negative impact. So it seems a bit odd, because if you say stop fishing in a place, surely you're going to lose that fishery. But maybe those places are, I'm a minute over my time, so I won't go into details. But in fact, there's no evidence anywhere at any time that marine protected areas result in loss of fisheries, but there's at least 44 examples published in literature where there's benefits. And the other thing is that any country can afford to have marine reserves. In fact, most countries that have the biggest ones are in developing countries and small island nations. This is an example from a website showing many of the red areas here, which are established marine protected areas, largely in the Pacific Ocean, by countries with very small populations. And they do this because it's common sense to them to protect everything first. That's the precautionary principle, and then you license any activities within it. So they're not expensive. In fact, if you're doing nothing, then MPAs are expensive, because now you're going to actually manage your resources. But if you're already managing resources, MPAs are really just a change in management rules. So we want to move from the current situation as business as usual, which I think we've agreed is not satisfactory, to a better situation in the future. We need to think of all the stakeholders, including the future generations. This is from Lee Marine Reserve. There's a glass bottom boat there. And this is a program run by the girl in the middle. Well, she's now a mother. I suppose I shouldn't call her a girl. But where she takes school children swimming inside and outside marine reserves, and they just see the difference. You don't need any more scientific data after that. So my final conclusions is that we need these marine reserves as a safe haven for not only biodiversity and nature, but also for our own resources in the future. It's not radical. It's a very, very old idea to set aside areas for nature. We need to empower the local communities to manage these and set aside some reference sites which are no fishing, because they're the baseline. Then we know what's natural and what's not natural and how we're affecting the ocean. So it should become normal, I hope, in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Mark, for that. And to pick up on, building on his summary right there at the end, is that he said the difference between paper parks and real protected areas is growing. There is no example of a negative for fisheries, but 44 papers quoting positives. And he addressed a range of the myths and misunderstandings, and particularly told us about one of the largest MPAs in the world was set up in the area of Hawaii, and then showed us some beautiful pictures along the way. So now I am going to invite one indeed of the exiled rebels who is coming back to us, Valerie Hickey, to now speak on this topic, Healthy Seas, How Are We Faring? Valerie is Global Director of Environment, Natural Resources and the Blue Economy at the World Bank. Valerie, the floor is yours and welcome home.
Thank you so much, Susan. Dave Gillere, I have to say it is wonderful to be a prodigal rebel back in the Republic of Cork to talk about the oceans. But interestingly, I'm not actually here because I'm from Cork, even though we'll all admit that every meeting would be better if there were Cork women at them. I'm actually here because the World Bank is really invested in the success of Ireland and all things related to the blue economy. Rashid called Ireland a large ocean state. I'll go further and say we're a lion. A large island ocean nation state. And part of our job at the World Bank is to look and identify those lions that are roaring loudly and that can serve as examples to the developing world as to how we can integrate development, climate, and nature to deliver jobs and GDP, to bend the emission curve to zero, and to save nature. Some of you might wonder what the World Bank is. It's a very fair question. So we are a specialized agency of the United Nations. We invest every year about $120 billion into the developing world to end poverty on a livable planet. And we've recognized in the last decade that there cannot be a world without poverty in a world without a healthy ocean. And it's funny because this wasn't always the case. When I joined the World Bank 20 years ago, nobody talked about the ocean. Nobody cared about the ocean. Nobody saw the relevance of the ocean to development. That has completely changed. And it changed because we got economists to join us. I wish scientists had as much power as economists, but the reality is they don't yet. But when the economists started to put the real numbers on the table, we realized that the ocean matters for development. 260 million people employed in fisheries jobs. And those are jobs, by the way, in marine fisheries that ChatGPT can never take away. Just in sub-Saharan Africa, we've looked at the numbers, and there's going to be 75 million people employed in fisheries by 2030. Those are incredibly important jobs because they deliver not just jobs and money in people's pockets, they're critical for food security. And in a world where tonight, 828 million people are going to go to bed hungry. If they don't have access to fish, if they don't have the ability to fish, that number is going to go a hell of a lot higher. And we can't let that happen. So we're interested in the ocean, but not just because we want to be defensive and make sure that what it provides today can continue to provide, but because of the opportunities. And again, this is where we've had our economists look at this. Just take seaweed alone. The seaweed market globally was worth around 17 or 18 billion dollars in 2021. It's expected to be worth $85 billion by 2026. That's a huge opportunity for jobs and GDP, growing a resource that is critically important for biodiversity and can suck in carbon better than anything else. So there are opportunities, but there are also threats. And we know the threats. You all know them better than I do. The biggest one, of course, is we've heard about overfishing, but marine litter is something that we're all talking about much more. 10 million tons of litter dumped into the ocean every year. 10 million tons. That's 81 dump trucks every hour of every day dumped into the ocean. 81 every hour of every day. In the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, we've all heard about it, there are 6 pounds of plastic for every pound of plankton. If you want to see a trophic collapse, that's where it starts. That's how it starts. And that's why we're so interested in really thinking about the leadership of Lions and sharing good examples from around the world to show what can be done. And in particular, because we're a bank, we want to look at the challenge of finance. Mark said that parks aren't too expensive. Every country can do them, but that doesn't mean they're not a cost center. They are. And so finding a way to pay for them matters. And I have to really congratulate the Fair Seas Coalition for taking this question incredibly seriously and doing 2 things that people don't do enough. And it's 2 lessons I'm going to take with me to every country I work in. The first is before you start talking about where you're going to find the money, you have to be able to quantify how much money you need. And you have to do it by working bottom up. You have to talk to all of the shareholders, understand what the cost is going to be. And then you have to understand where that money can come from. And again, Fair Seas is doing something that too many people and too many countries forget to do, which is think about money from 3 different pots, all equally important. The first pot, domestic public budget, because marine protected areas are public assets and they should be paid for in part by public budget. The second is international public finance. Here in Ireland, talking to institutions like the European Investment Bank. In developing countries, talking to us, making us put some of that $120 billion that we spend every year into financing marine protected areas. And the third is private finance. Because the private sector benefits from a healthy ocean, so they need to help pay for it as well. And I'll finish by saying there's basically 4 additional lessons that we need to remember when we think about finance for marine protected areas. The first is that not all marine protected areas are the same, not just as Mark described because they have different aims and different objectives, but because they're in different places. They have different challenges, so you have to figure out the cost park by park. The second is that you can't just think about the finance for the park itself. You have to think about the supply chain of finance. Because one of the saddest things, I spent last week with some folks, including Catherine Cronin here, talking about the new plastics pollution treaty that is being negotiated. One of the discussions they're having there is around abandoned ghost fishing gear. But truth is, it has been illegal to abandon fishing gear in the ocean since 1973 with the MARPOL Treaty. But because there has never been any money put into prosecuting that, we're once again talking about how do we regulate it, but the regulation already exists. We have to make sure there's money to criminalize bad behavior in parks, not just at crime scene, but all the way to the courthouse. The third key we have to remember, we cannot put the price and the cost of protected areas on the shoulders of those people least able to carry that cost. That means in most communities on the fishermen, on the women who sell the fish. We have to find ways to cover their lost income. That's a critical part of the supply chain of finance. And then finally, and this was discussed and mentioned by everyone who spoke before me, when it comes to setting up marine protected areas, the process is as important as the final result. Getting everybody around the table. Minister Noonan said it. Making sure that all of the shareholders are sitting at the table and have the capacity to take their seat and amplify their voice so that the end product is something that is co-owned by everybody. And the end product of this Fair Seas discussion with the Irish government about legislation is one we're going to be watching very closely so we can take those successes and share them with the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Dr. Valerie Hickey. And in summary, Valerie said that Ireland should be deemed a lion, a large island ocean nation, and that this MPA conversation is part of bending the emission curve to zero. She quoted the 250 million jobs in fisheries around the world that ChatGPT can't take away. And she mentioned that 10 million tonnes of marine litter is dumped into the sea every year. She said there's 2 lessons she'll take everywhere in the world. One is quantify how much money you need from the bottom up. But number 2 is think about where the money comes from, including domestic public budgets, international public budgets, as well as private finance. And then she finished with the 4 lessons. Not all MPAs are the same. Think about the supply chain of finance. The price of shouldering the burden of MPAs from a cost point of view can't be put on those who least handle it, and the process is as important as the final result. And so, our second person who's returned to Cork is Brian MacSharry, who is Head of Group Biodiversity and Ecosystems at European Environment Agency. Brian, the floor is yours.
My mum is going to be very proud that the Lord Mayor introduced me, so I have achieved what I wanted to set out for. I'm immensely proud to be back in my home city, presenting on a topic I love completely. If I pause and get traumatized during this presentation, it's because the last time I was here, I was in my final exams for UCC, so if I kind of go, oh, what am I studying? But I mean, I've been lucky enough to work in an area I love for my entire professional career, so I've been really happy with that. Protected areas is something I've always liked, being out in nature. I've always liked biodiversity. I didn't know why, I just did. My family, we love swimming, kayaking. We're brainwashing our young kids to be swimmers and divers, whether they want to be or not. My honeymoon was kayaking in British Columbia. Our engagement was diving in Raja Ampat in Indonesia. It's something that means something to me personally and to my family. But I'm going to talk now about what we're doing in Europe. And, this is a map showing protected areas in Europe. You may not be able to see it too well. Again, a bit about the European Environment Agency. We're based in Copenhagen. We're an agency of the European Union. And we were set up in 1993 after Chernobyl, when they realized there was no coherent information in the environment. So people knew there was an issue, but they couldn't communicate about it. There, thank you very much. And we work with 38 countries across Europe to try and create knowledge for the environment. So, as has been said, we live in a blue planet. 71% of our planet is the ocean. 39% of that is within our national jurisdictions. The remainder is in the high seas. In Europe, we've got about 5.6 million square kilometres. In Ireland, we have somewhere around 880, which is about 12 times the extent of our land area. So we really are an island land in the ocean. Again, preaching to the converted, biodiversity, why do we care? If you like to eat, drink, live, you care about biodiversity. It is our life system, it is the life support system of our planet. And importantly, we're seeing it's very important to regulate. Dr. Rashid mentioned about COVID. If you're healthy, you could deal with stuff. A healthy planet is a resilient planet. An unhealthy planet is not a resilient planet. There was a bit of discussion about valuation. There was a fantastic report by a guy called Professor Das Gupta from Cambridge University that was funded by the UK Treasury Agency. And there's a lot of quotes in there, but the one that struck out to me was that governments pay people more to exploit nature than to protect nature. This short-termism is something that is embodied in what we do as the economies of Europe and elsewhere. A bit about the state. We know the state of the water of our oceans are poor. We don't exactly know how poor because there isn't a lot of data. So there's a massive data gap, but what we do know is that there's a lot of them, these bar graphs, they're all poor or bad. A lot of unknowns. We know unknown isn't good. It makes it difficult then to understand what is the trend. This is an extract from our State of Nature report, which every country in the EU contributes to. I think it's the largest biodiversity project in the world. 260,000 people contribute to it. And again, when we get the information, we can say what the state of nature is, what the trend is. Here there's a lot of unknowns and question marks are poor. So we need to start working out how we address this. And again, what's causing this loss? It's all been mentioned. I'll say it again. It's us and what we do is the short answer. It's overexploitation. It's, overfishing, bottom-trawling fishing, pollution, urbanization, our effects of living in by the water when we do it negatively. That exasperates then the climate change. Again, that's us, which makes the ocean more acidic, destroys the plankton, destroys the calcareous shells. But what are we doing? In Europe, what we did in 2020, building upon existing legislation, was we had the European Biodiversity Strategy. It's about 20 pages long, but what it crucially says is we need to protect and restore our nature. We need to have an ambitious target of 30 by 30, with 10% of it strictly protected. And thankfully, in December last year, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework incorporated a lot of the same language and concepts in there. So we now have a clear guiding of what we want to be doing. So how are we doing this and where are we? At the moment in the EU, we have about 12% of our ocean covered by protected areas, quotation mark. You can see globally here this varies from 15% in North America, 24% in Latin America. Globally about 8%. The high seas is just over 1%. Mark made the nice point that, what do these numbers really mean? We know that they vary significantly. So in Ireland, we have just over 2.25% designated as protected. We've got several more percent being added on as proposed in Natura 2000 sites. But we see there's a massive variation. And it's fantastic to hear the Minister reiterate the plan in Ireland that we're going to have this bill to enhance and protect our existing network and bring it up to 30% as well. One of the key tools that is used is the Natura 2000 network. If I love protected areas, I love Natura 2000 network. It's not perfect, but it's a really good tool to build upon. And the failings of Natura 2000 network are in the implementation of the Habitats and Birds Directive, not necessarily the directives themselves. As was mentioned, the network covers a certain amount of species and a certain amount of habitats. It doesn't cover everything. But there's a nice new resource we have on our website. If you go into look for Natura 2000 viewer on the European Environment Agency, you'll find a nice new map viewer and a few information pages that tell you about what is happening and what is being done. But again, I think it's really important to flag that we're not talking about just 30% for the sake of it. We're talking about the quality aspect of that. So it's not a either or, it's both and. We need 30% and a minimum, and we need it to be quality. It has to be effective. It has to be well-resourced. It has to be. You have to engage with the stakeholders. It's fantastic to hear that Ireland is actually going back and saying to everybody who's impacted, what's going to happen here? What's going to, how do we work together on this? There was a mention of bottom-trawling fishing. This is a map with a lot of colours. My question is, can you see the bright blue on this map? The bright blue is where there are marine protected areas where bottom-trawling fishing does not happen. I made this map. I've zoomed in on the computer screen. I can't really find any. And this is a problem that we have conflicting policies in Europe. We have the Common Fishery Policy, we have the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, we have the Birds Directive, Habitats Directive, They're all telling us to do different things. They're using different language, often to explain the same things, and often they're telling us to do very different things. Bottom-trawling fishing is not acceptable in any marine protected area, full stop. The science is very clear on this, yet it is allowed, encouraged, I'm not too sure, but this is publicly available data. It's not something we've hidden, and I think it's underselling the scale of the problem. Again, what can we do as a society? There's a lot. Societal change was mentioned by several speakers. It's what we need to do. We need to use the buzzword of mainstreaming biodiversity into what we do, like clean water, education for everyone. And we need to use the policies we have. And then the last question I leave to an adopted Irishman to answer is, can we do it? It's Féidir Linn. Well, yes, we can. But we need to do it now, not in 5 years' time. The cost of doing something now versus cost of doing something in 5-10 years' time is dramatic, and the risk of it not succeeding increases. So I think my last 5 seconds were, yes, we should act, and we should act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Brian MacSharry. So to summarise there, first of all, we learned an awful lot about his relationship, where he got engaged, where he went on honeymoon, and now where he spends his time with his kids. That is an interesting introduction to any speaker. He then went on to point out that biodiversity loss is being driven by, and whilst I was getting ready to document what was up on the slide, he finished that sentence by saying, us. We're driving it, and indeed, he also mentioned about the status of people in the room may be different to general population when it comes to this, but fundamentally it comes down to human activity. The numbers he quoted were 12.1% of the EU 27 is protected. Globally, that is higher than the global average of 8.16%, but about half that of Latin America at 24%. But he did say that 30 by 30 needs to not just be quantitative, but qualitative as well, effective and have an impact. He spoke about conflicting policies in Europe, and the last point he mentioned picked up very closely on what Dr. Rashid mentioned earlier on about the cost of doing something now versus in 5 years' time, and then he gave us that rallying cry of Is Féidir Linn. So to those of you who may not be familiar with the Irish language, that means yes, we can. And so I'm now going to hand over for the final of the 4 presentations, which is to Donal Griffin from Fair Seas Ireland. Donal, over to you.
Hey everyone, my name's Donal Griffin. I'm with Fair Seas. I'm the policy officer, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you all today here in Cork on World Ocean Day. So happy World Ocean Day, everyone. Get the slide. Okay, so the title of my presentation today, Ireland's Fair Seas, on our way to 30% MPAs by 2030, question mark there at the end. And it's going to take the brilliant global perspective there and nail right down into the MPA legislative timeframes here and where we're at in Ireland with our MPAs. So these are the themes and key messages I'm going to talk about. First of all, Ireland's marine area is enormous. We've heard that referenced at all, and there'll be a map coming up soon. It's our view that stewardship by successive governments has failed to live its full ecological, its full economic, or its full social potential. We have that potential. We haven't realised it yet. And in terms of MPAs, and it's changed brilliantly what Brian just said there, the quantity and quality of Ireland's current MPA network, that is Natura 2000 network, is poor. And we know that, and I think that's accepted by certainly most people in the room, and that a transformational change is needed to do things better. And on that front, as we've heard this morning as well, the Irish government is drafting new marine protected area legislation as we speak. So it's an incredibly exciting moment to be in this field in Ireland at the moment. And I'll finish off by giving my reflections on addressing the question that I posed at the start: is Ireland on its way to 30 by 30? And spoiler alert, I think it is. I think we are. But there are caveats in there that we need to be mindful of and address as well. So this is the real map of Ireland that the Mayor referenced earlier on, and it's fantastic. 10 times the size of the island, 488,000 kilometres squared. Brian had a different number there, I'll have to check my numbers. Includes territorial waters, the EEZ, parts of the continental shelf. You know, you can just look at this map and it's clear to everyone that Ireland has a duty and a responsibility to look after this vast marine area, and that duty and responsibility itself is vast. And one of the ways we look after our marine area is through MPAs, and that's why we're all here today. So the first thing, how effective is Ireland's current MPA network? The first thing to say is that it consists primarily of Natura 2000 sites. We've heard a little bit about that, SACs and SPAs designated under EU law. 8.3% of Irish water is designated, up from 2.1% recently, so that's fantastic progress in terms of our quantity aspect. But in terms of the quality, we have site-specific conservation objectives, management plans, associated conservation measures lacking across the board. And these are the things that are needed to make MPAs effective, to deliver the job for nature that we want them to. And there's been associated court cases, EU Commission warnings, it's been rapping on the knuckles. We've a long way to go, you know. And we believe that a paradigm shift is needed in how we designate and implement MPAs in Ireland, and the implementation there is key. As Brian alluded to, it's the implementation of various policy that we're failing at. So on that front then, and it was referenced by the Minister earlier, Ireland's Programme for Government in 2020, they committed to developing comprehensive legislation for the identification, the designation, and management of marine protected areas. So that was fantastic. That got the ball rolling officially. And it poses the question then, for me at least, can this new MPA legislation be the paradigm shift needed to properly protect the nature at sea, is what we all want? And just to give you a little bit of timeline for the legislation and the journey that we've been on, because it goes back now a few years. In 2020, the Independent MPA Advisory Group, convened by the government, published a report, a fantastic report I'll add, expanding Ireland's marine protected area network. And it went out for public consultation the next year and received overwhelming positive feedback. And then in 2022, last year, the general scheme, the first step on the legislative journey for MPA bill, was published. And then earlier this year, so the momentum has been building. Earlier this year, the general scheme itself underwent pre-legislative scrutiny in the Housing, Local Government and Heritage Joint Oireachtas Committee, and they published their report then, the recommendations of how the bill could be improved and what it should include and how it should do it. And I'll take this opportunity to say Fair Seas strongly welcomes all those 45 recommendations that they have in that report. I'm not going to go through them all. We believe the effectiveness of new MPAs will be strengthened by their full incorporation into the MPA bill, because they deal with really important, fundamental, significant issues in delivering an effective MPA network. Not least, these are just some of them. So the idea of a network itself and the importance of ecological coherence. The 10% strict protection targets already been mentioned. I'm really glad it has. That's critical to have that on a statutory footing. To have timeframes and time limits in there for accountability, but also to drive the process forward once we get it. The increased focus on restoration. It's never been so clear how important that aspect is now with the goings-on with the nature restoration law at EU and at national level. This is critical, I feel like, the MPA bill needs to facilitate and help us facilitate the better management of the current Natura 2000 network. It needs to do all it can to help that process, because it will all become one, our MPA network, even though they're designated out of different directives and laws. And again, lastly but not least, as we've heard, stakeholder participation. That's so crucial to be really concise and clear what is needed, what is required, what is mandated, the process, but also the principles of stakeholder engagement. the open, honesty, transparency, inclusiveness, these types of things to guide how we do that stakeholder engagement. So to bring us back to the timeline then, in 2023, it's Fair Seas' hope and our job to make sure, I guess, that the MPA bill is introduced into the Dáil as soon as possible. And it's fantastic to hear the Minister say that that's on track to happen before the summer recess. And even more important then is that that bill goes through the various parliamentary procedure and report different stages and is signed off into law as soon as possible. Because it's often said of the climate emergency, but you don't quite hear it as often with the biodiversity emergency, that time is running out. But time is certainly running out. And that will allow, if it is signed into law soon, this year, we can begin in earnest the implementation. And that is the key point that we've heard already to success. And just a quick note here, there's 3 reports we've had in the last 8 months from the pre-legislative scrutiny, the report on biodiversity from the Joint Committee on Environment and Climate Action, and the fantastic report in the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss. And it should come to a surprise to no one here that the MPA recommendations in each of these reports are the exact same. They're calling for the same thing. So the writing's on the wall. Do you know? We know what we need to do. I think we know how we should go about it. So it's a case of let's have the leadership, let's have the brave decision-making, and let's get on with it, I guess. And so very finally then, to reflect on this question that I posed at the start, and I know I'm running over. Is Ireland on its way to 30% marine protected areas by 2030? I think the answer is yes. Ireland has never been in a better position to meet its 30 by 30 commitments. We have willing government, proactive ministers, huge public support for this, there's no doubt about that. New legislation is forthcoming that we just heard. And because we're starting from a lower base, we have the opportunity to learn lessons from other countries and do things more efficiently from the beginning. But if we tweak that question just a little and ask, is Ireland on its way to effectively protecting 30% of its seas for nature? That's the quality aspect of MPAs. I think we don't quite know yet. Because despite the positive momentum I've just ran through, the content and the timeframes of the new legislation are still unknown. They're on track, but we still don't know what the final act will look like. We've seen the general scheme, we haven't quite seen the bill yet. The implementation of the new act and whatever's in it will take time, and that's inevitable, and there's no getting around that, and time is running out, as I mentioned. We're starting from a low base, so that absolutely offers opportunities to do things better and more efficiently, but it also means we have a longer road to travel. And month on month, I guess, year on year, there's increasing demand placed on our seas, whether that's offshore renewable energy, fishing, recreation, shipping, all these things. And yet, I think it's still true to say that Ireland has never been in a better position to live up to the letter and the spirit, and that's to say the quantity and the quality of its 30 by 30 commitments to protect nature at sea. So I think we can afford to be ocean optimistic about this. I think we should be ocean optimistic about this, and it's Fair Seas' job now and in the future to make sure Ireland and the government and successive governments are on the right track to the right 30 by 30. So thank you very much. Gura Mogov.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Dr. Donal from Fair Seas Ireland. And so he says, is Ireland on its way to 30 by 30? He said it is indeed. 8.3% of Irish waters are now designated. That's up from 2.3%. He says the momentum has been building, and Fair Seas strongly welcomes the 45 recommendations in the report that he referenced. But what I thought was particularly interesting is that he used the 2 words. They're both fundamental and significant. So making sure we were reinforced on that. Again and again and again, this number comes up of the 10% strictly protected MPAs. And again, that started with Karen this morning, and it has continued to be mentioned right throughout. He said stakeholder participation is so important. While Valerie mentioned the process is as important as the outcome, also what Donal added to that, though, is the principles of that engagement is key too. He also said if the legislation is signed into law this year, then the leadership needs to be there and then to be followed through with taking the brave decisions, but particularly to get on with it. He also said that in each of the 3 reports that he referenced towards the very end there from Fair Seas Ireland, he said the calls to action are the very same from the point of view of MPAs, and he said Ireland has never been in a better position to be ocean ready. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each of the 4 people who presented, if I can ask you all to come over to this side of the stage, please, so that you can join me for a panel discussion. And while all of that is happening, I'm now going to ask the team, if I can, to just get ready, as we are now going to show a video from a woman that is known to you all, Dr. Sylvia Earle, and she is the National Geographic Explorer and Mission Blue founder and CEO, who has got an introduction and video message for us.
Hello, Ireland. I'm Sylvia Earle. I'm a National Geographic Explorer, founder of Mission Blue, and a champion for the ocean everywhere. I want to welcome you to the first Fair Seas Conference in Cork City Hall on World Ocean Day 2023. This is a crucial time for communities around Ireland to gather as legislation is being developed and finalized to create national marine protected area legislation. I hope today's conference will enable communities across Ireland to focus on the next steps of designation and the importance of inclusive and participatory stakeholder engagement in that process. Stakeholder engagement is fundamental to deciding how these new protected areas will be managed. Everyone has a stake in the outcomes, including the fish, the whales, and the birds. You must speak for them and for the children of the future who cannot be here to make the decisions that are now up to you. Management that works delivers positive conservation outcomes for wildlife and habitats, and it also delivers for society. The waters surrounding Ireland are rich with beautiful deep-water corals, magnificent basking sharks. They're home to a stunning array of marine life, from the tiniest forage fish to seabirds, whales, dolphins, and sharks. Your beautiful Emerald Isle sits like a jewel in the North Atlantic Ocean, and your enormous maritime area makes you the guardians of ocean giants, rare coral reefs of the deep, and steep staging posts of global importance soaring seabird colonies. Mission Blue was delighted to announce the first Irish Hope Spot in Ireland this year, and we look forward to working with the ocean community in Ireland to continue restoring, preserving, and conserving the ocean for now and for all who come in the future.
Gentlemen, Dr. Sylvia Earle. Well, first of all, thank you all very much for each of those 4 individual presentations, for very different perspectives, but aligned on the same message. And I can now tell you I have 35 unanswered questions here in front of me, and I have 21 minutes to pose them to you. So I'm going to start off, Valerie, I'd like to put this one to you. This one has had 24 upvotes. It's right up here at the top. And this is the one that I would like to put to you. So if I was just to give context to this, overall, can we have both conservation and development? Is the overall arching theme to this question, but it gets more nuanced, and that is balancing the economics of offshore renewable energy, fisheries and MPAs is an upcoming topic in Ireland. What is your advice on finding a balance?
So, Susan, I would say it's not only possible, but it's fundamentally necessary. In too many countries in this world, particularly in coastal countries, in small islands, when things go bad, when people are hungry, when people lose their jobs, the response from government often is, go fish. So the ocean has been a social safety net for generations. And what we have to do is figure out how you can integrate development and nature and climate. Because we heard from Danny last night that the ocean is the climate champion, and it's absolutely true. Doing it is a lot harder than saying it. And that's where I really do believe that the importance of process matters. Marine spatial planning matters. Getting everybody around the table to have an honest conversation about what are the policies that need to be in place, and how do we make sure the policies that are put in place stay in place, and that you don't end up designated a marine protected area only to find a year later the Ministry of Energy has designated the exact same space a concession for mining. So policies have to be right. The institutions have to be strong. The institutions that are charged with managing the process and implementing the agreements of the process have to be strong. The infrastructure has to be in place. And the marine spatial planning process has to identify what that infrastructure is. And not just the infrastructure on land, not just the tools needed by a marine protected area agency, but what about the digital infrastructure? And then finally, what's the price tag? And who's going to have to pay for that price? That's why this process really is important. And that's the only way that people, all the shareholders, can self-determine how their ocean should be used. And that's how we'll integrate development and conservation.
So the sea has been a social safety net. The institutions need to be strong, digital infrastructure needs to be put in place, and the price needs to be clear, as well as who's paying for it. The next question that's come up here, I'm going to put this to you, Brian, and the reason I am is that I think it ties, I don't know whether it's a direct result of, but it certainly ties into the graph that you showed. 19 upvotes, and that is, should and can Ireland ban all bottom trawling in our waters?
Yeah, good question. I'm not too sure what my agency's official policy on this is. I think the science is very clear. The answer is yes. Bottom trawling is really a complete destructive form of fishing. I think the return of investment isn't particularly high from it. And you see the impact when this is happening. It scours the seabed. It produces this dust, as Dr. Rashid said about the deep sea mining, and that contaminates the wider landscape as well. So you've got the spillover effects from where you've done something, but then the knock-on effects around that as well. Again, I think we're saying that maybe there's a case for it happening in certain places, but not in marine protected areas. Again, it's about what are they used, what's their sea use, their ocean use. It is for protecting biodiversity. That has multiple benefits for us as a society. Why are we allowing competing interests to happen in these areas? There's a large amount of ocean. It's not always acceptable to use it for everything and anything, but we need to balance the conflicts that we have. So I would say, yes, we should ban it.
So the sea use needs to be facilitative of competing interests, and there's a big ocean out there, is fundamentally where you're coming from. Mark, I think I'd like to put the next one to you, because you talked about that story, particularly in New Zealand. So the question is, how do you sell the idea that less fishing means more fish in the long term and forever? The science is there, but we are struggling to get progress, and that is 16 upvotes.
Well, actually, most fishermen know this, but the representative organisations don't seem to admit it very often. And fishermen fish on the boundaries all the time. It's both sports and recreational and commercial. It's quite visible if you go to the edges of marine reserves, especially near populated areas. You'll see the lobster pots forming a nice little line right around the boundary. Traditionally, people have known this. So I have a friend who goes to Southeast Asia and Indonesia, where they go to villages and they say, we'll help you get a marine reserve established. And this is the principle that you'll have some places that are no fishing and some that are. And he says within 1 hour, people either agree or disagree that they will do it, because they all understand that there's a benefit from leaving your resources in the bank, as it were. Because as well, that's in an emergency measure. I think somebody mentioned that. Well, it's sort of like what you're saying. So what happens if there's a crisis and you can't go fishing because there's no fuel for the boats? Well, you could still fish in towards coast, and maybe the marine reserves would be a bank which you could access in emergency situations. And many of the Maori people and other Pacific Islanders set aside no-take areas for special occasions, where then you can go fishing for a special feast, for a special occasion, but at no other time, because they know that resource won't last if people are allowed to go fishing it all the time.
So leaving resources in the bank is the overall writing message, with the overriding message in order to stimulate that apart from the science.
Yeah, and there's a lot of misinformation. There's economic models, no offense to the economists. Well, they'll predict the cost of fisheries by closing areas to fisheries, and they always predict it, but I cannot find one case where they actually show that there was a cost to fisheries. But I can find many cases where there's a benefit to fisheries in the long term.
Susan, can I come in here for 1 second? Because there's a difference between knowing something, and I agree, There's no better stewards of the ocean than fishermen who know their livelihoods depend on the fish being there and being healthy and being bigger. But knowing it and living with the consequences are two very different things. Because if all of us who work in these lovely institutions were asked, listen, you're going to have to go without a salary for the next 2 years to make sure that, for example, the World Bank or the European Environment Agency could have enough money in the bank to pay you 2% more in 3 years, we wouldn't be very happy. We'd know maybe it was good for the sustainability of our organization's finances. We wouldn't accept it. And that's why it's critical that we give fishermen a chance to be at the table and we make sure we offer them a way to be made whole. Because we cannot sacrifice fishermen and the men and women who depend on the ocean on the altar of conservation. They have to be with us on this journey.
A question has come up with that, Valerie, that I do want to put to you. But before I get to that, Donal, I'd like to put one to you. 14 upvotes on this. Regular and scientifically robust monitoring is vital to inform management of MPAs. Will a plan and budget for monitoring be part of the MPA bill?
I think it should, and I think it will. I think the resources and the capacity to deal with everything that an MPA needs to deliver is key, and that's one of the reasons why our Sustainable Finance Report that will be published later this summer is so key, and shining some light on the ways in which we can fund our MPAs. And monitoring and enforcement, I capture that all as the management. That's just the basic management that you need to do in an MPAs, and it's something that we haven't done so well in the past. There's lots of fantastic monitoring going on in Ireland, there's no doubt about that, but there are huge, and Brian mentioned it earlier, data gaps. And enforcement's a big element. I know we have the Naval Service in the room today, and they will likely have a role in that, given the information in the general scheme. So I think every aspect of MPA needs to be well funded and delivered well and effectively. And I'll say it again, and it's already been stressed, the stakeholder engagement is just absolutely critical to that. And stakeholder engagement with the actual authorities that are going to be on the ground, boots on the ground, but with the people and the coastal communities. And you know, this conversation is absolutely fantastic. And when we get to a certain stage, and sooner, hopefully, sooner than the sooner the better, it will actually go out into the regions, and it'll go out into the coastal communities, and it'll be a really local conversation happening as well, because you will get voices and you'll get different perspectives in that local environment that people and perspectives that would never turn up to an event like this in Cork, but are absolutely critical to the success of that one patch of their sea that they have lived in and grown up and seen change and delighted in all their lives. So that's the type of people that we also need to have in the room in the wider sense.
It's interesting, as you were saying, that each of the other three panellists were involuntarily nodding. I don't know whether you noticed, but all of your heads were moving in the same direction at the same time. So there's certainly emphatic agreement to that. Valerie, can I go back to this point about, I want to paraphrase and not quote, because I didn't exactly get it word for word, but you said that the people who are involved, the fishermen and the women who are involved in this industry don't need to be sacrificed at the altar of conservation. On this note, there are 16 upvotes on this one. Should we pay fishers to not fish in an MPA? We pay farmers for environmental initiatives, so why not fishers?
So that's the discussion that we have to have. How do we make fishermen and women, and not just the men and women who are out doing the harvesting, but the men and women in the shops who sell the fish? There's an entire value chain of people who depend on fisheries, and we can't forget any of them. We have to have that conversation around what will make them whole. And it may be paying them. It may be repurposing subsidies. There's a lot of money spent on fishery subsidies in this country and in the European Union and globally. Many of these perverse subsidies, we could repurpose those subsidies so those fishermen and women get the same amount of money but to do something different, to fish less instead of fish more. But those are conversations we need to have with the men and women who will be impacted, not just something that we have discussions in Washington, D.C. or in Dublin or in Brussels. The people who are most impacted need to be the voices we magnify the most.
And so, Brian, I don't know whether it's Brian or Mark, or maybe both of you might have a thought on this. This has had 10 upvotes. There was a lot being said about fishing in MPAs. What about aquaculture in MPAs? That entails relevant activities, not only in finfish, but also shellfish and seaweed farming.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can maybe start and Mark can come in. I mean, I think when we look at, again, you have to think about what is the purpose of that space you've designated for a marine protected area. In some cases, aquaculture may be compatible with the objectives of it, but you have to consider what you're doing there. And a lot of times aquaculture, there's a lot of pollution comes from the feed and the antibiotics that come in that pollutes the water, and that is a serious challenge. So if you've looked at an area and you said, I understand the conservation objectives, I know what I'm protecting for, I can manage it or mitigate against it, then perhaps. But in a lot of cases that is not being done, and we can see they're being put in there, and there's a lot of negative aspects from that. I mean, so they can be fine in certain places, but in other places, no.
Anything you want to
add? It concerns me that sometimes when new things like wind energy or aquaculture come to the table, people are immediately antagonistic and defensive against them. And yet they accept traditional things which they know, like bottom trawling, are harmful. So I think we need to look at all the uses of the ocean openly and look at what kind of future we want. And business as usual is not the best future. And the ocean is a public resource in contrast to land farming, where farmers own their land generally. So there is a different situation there as well. And I could see many situations where marine protected areas and wind energy can be very compatible, and different types of aquaculture, which is not just salmon farming, but seaweed farming was mentioned, and shellfish farming. And I think and younger generations might be more excited about looking to these futures and alternative lifestyles and jobs they will have with tourism, energy, and these other benefits. And so I think the other two things that are important is trust and equity. Yeah. And this is where I don't envy the minister's job, because that's what the politicians have got to navigate through and try to get most people happy most of the time. And this is why we're having this conversation. So I think getting this information out is great. Yeah.
If I could stick a pin in the point you made about young people and the alternative careers, we are going to have Emer Manning, who's going to be speaking right after lunch about this very theme. So just to bookmark that point. I've had two questions, 8 upvotes each. One goes to Valerie and Donal. So I'll just read out both, and then you might both take them on. So the first one says, for Dr. Valerie, where can private finance go, or what platforms see MPA investment opportunities? The second one says, Donal and Valerie, what do you think we can do to ensure that MPA funding from private equity sources is embedded in our legislative systems, e.g. in the offshore wind industry? So Valerie, would you like to take one, and then Donal, you can follow up?
So the first thing missing right now from enabling private capital to move into this space are metrics. At the end of the day, metrics move money. And we don't have enough metrics right now to show that as you put money into marine protected areas, things get better. There's good science. It often lags too long to keep private money happy, because private money moves on a quarterly basis, on a quarterly financial reporting basis. We need the metrics that can show how investments in marine protected areas, investments in conservation, actually have real returns. Returns in fisheries numbers, returns in wind power, whatever it is. And those metrics are missing. And in a world where 60% of countries are in debt distress, money is scarce because of the cost of living, money is expensive because of inflation, there isn't enough money to go around. And if we don't have the metrics to prove that conservation works and it creates a return, then we're never going to be able to attract private capital into this space.
Donal, do you want to pick up on, well, sorry, actually, Donal, just before I do, I will mention there was another question that came in that you've addressed, Valerie, which is, can you give us some specific dollar figure about the benefits of strict protection, e.g. X dollars for X kilometres squared? And I think that's your point, is the challenge of doing that. Yeah. Sorry, Donal.
Yeah, just to say, well, I'm not an economist anyway, so I'm probably not best to speak on specifically about private equity and the role of that, but someone said earlier that the state should definitely pay at least a large part of this when it comes to MPAs. They are a public good, they're a public asset, and it's their responsibility. I said in my slide earlier, it's all our responsibility in the grander sense, but it is actually the government's and the state's responsibility to look after the marine area, not just MPAs, inside and outside of MPAs. So I think that's a big part of it. And then when you get to the polluter pays principle, or the industry that's having an impact, there are different arguments to be made there, I think, depending on the type of industry it is, and not to be putting pressure on, fishing communities, your point well made earlier, Valerie. But there's another thing that maybe I would speak to more, in that however we fund it, and I think we can fund it, and I think we will fund it, and we should fund it, is that we need to make sure that money then is spent effectively. And that's a really important point, I think, that needs, because there has been money put into the Natura 2000 network in Ireland and other places around Europe, and we're not seeing the benefits now, and we haven't been seeing them. And I'll not go as far as to say that was a waste of money, but it wasn't a good spend of money, let's say. So I think getting the legislation, and I'll always bring it back to the legislation at the moment, but bringing it back to the legislation, the way to make our spending right is to get the legislation right, to make sure that when we do have a legislation and the process then to designate and to implement and to manage is on point and is actually delivering for nature, delivering the benefit and the conservation objectives that we want for nature. So yes, the money is a big part of it, but we've seen recently Ireland is not lacking in money at the moment. We have a huge surplus. It's projected to be even larger in the next few years. That mightn't last forever, but it doesn't need to. I was at the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss last year, and I touted the idea of $1 billion for biodiversity, and that was really just out of the air. It was a big number, but that is the big aspirational number that we need to be thinking about across the board, and a big part of that is MPAs and funding them properly.
Right.
Maybe just to come in on that, I happen to have some figures here which I prepared.
Oh, you happen to have them?
Yeah, no, it was just, there was a report done several years ago looking at the economic benefit of Natura 2000. And again, it covers land and sea, so the figures might vary a bit. But it said that annually there was 200 to 300 billion years of gross benefit coming in. And then when they looked at the overall benefits of restoring a broader variety of ecosystems, there was a 12 times return of investment. For every euro spent, it was at least 12 times. The nature restoration law has some text in there that shows that for every euro invested, there's 8 to 36 euro in return coming back. So I think what we have a challenge is understanding how do we track the benefits, and sometimes the benefits can be societal, they can be broader than what comes into my pocket. So, but I think the science, when we look at it, does show that all of these are investments, and they all come in. And maybe it's the generational aspect that Rashid was saying at the start, when you think in a longer time frame of it. But it's clear when money is invested wisely, there are benefits coming back in for it.
I would also say, though, when you look at numbers like that, if you were looking at money that is generated in a city economy or in an export-focused economy, that's very different from a rural and a more domestic one as well. So I would be interested to look further into that and to see the recurring revenue that will come out of it. But Mark, I do want to ask you, a subset of what particularly Donal and Brian are talking about here, this is 7 upvotes, should specific habitats or species be targeted for MPA designation to realise fisheries benefits, or should other factors drive where MPAs are placed?
Well, yes, because if you want to protect all fisheries, you need to protect a representative range of those habitats in the area. And that's what our MPA Europe project is doing, and that's what Ireland is doing at the moment in the Irish Sea. There's a project going on to select the most representative areas. So you have examples of all those habitats and hence all the species. But if you want areas to target for particular fisheries, then it makes sense to focus on that fishery. So I think it would be a real win for fisheries if instead of working in parallel with nature conservation management, they actually came and said, hey, we would like you to focus on protecting this area because we know it will benefit our fishery. And I've met fishery scientists in New Zealand who said, that would be a great idea, but it'll never happen. We're in different government departments, we're in different communities, and we just don't cooperate that way.
So the lack of joined-up thinking?
A lack of joint activity and cooperation. So, as you mentioned, with energy and these other sources, if the government can get these guys to say, you're going to work together, sorry children, if you want to share the cake, you all have to share it equally. So, and force people on the right path together.
I suppose when I hear you saying that, I'm thinking back to what we asked people earlier about what was the big change in action that needed to happen to enable change, and the biggest word that came up there was collaboration.
Yeah.
Mark, this was submitted an hour ago with 7 upvotes. I think it's really important to ask you, Mark, your shirt is absolutely fantastic. And I noticed it before the conference started. Where did you get it? And 7 people want to know. We have brought all of these people together, Mark, to find out about your fashion sense.
It was a gift from my brother's.
It was a gift.
From my brother's girlfriend who lives in Germany, and she's my brother's got a nice one too, actually. So
the shirt, you mean?
Yeah, a nice shirt. He's got a similar shirt with other wildlife on it. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's very, like I say, we really do learn a lot about our panellists here today. So as I bring this conversation to a close, the title of the panel discussion is Healthy Seas, How Are We Faring? And if I could start, Donal, I'll start with you. What one action do you want to see happen now that can really move the needle in the long term? You were the person that said action today, am I right? It was you that said action today, or was it you, Brian, that said action today makes a much bigger impact than taking action in 5 years' time. So what action do you want to see today that will make a big difference in the long term?
I think, and it's already been a common theme this morning, I think it's that 10% strict protection target in the legislation on a statutory footing. I think that will make a huge difference in moving the needle. And when I think about the legislation and the process that's to come once we actually have the bill and the act, we're all here, World Ocean Day. We've invited speakers from all around the world to share their knowledge, their wisdom, their know-how, their lessons learned regarding MPAs. And I often talk about measurements of success. And one of the measurements of success that you probably won't find in the legislation, but in my mind, a measurement of success is in 15 years' time, in 20 years' time, there are people in this room being invited to, the people involved in MPAs, invited to World Ocean Day conferences all around Europe, all around the world, and they're asking them, how did you do it?
Yeah.
How did you do it? Like, you have a fantastic network now. It's managed well, it has the political support, it has the capacity, it has the funding. You went from 2020 to 2.1% designation, maybe not fantastically managed. Now you have your 30% and more. You have it all there. So that is a measurement of success. And I think having that 10% target, strict protection target, is an indication of the ambition of the legislation. And I think it's the ambition, the high level of ambition of the legislation that we all want, and we'll make sure that the needle, moves, in your words. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we don't know what we're missing. That's what if we had, every county had an area the public could go and say there was completely natural, with abundance of marine life, then they would get it. And that's what happened in New Zealand when one marine reserve was set up for completely different purposes. And then everybody said it was like chocolates. They got one and they wanted more. We don't know what we're missing yet. And we can.
Is that your answer to my question as well? Because that's the last word. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Don't be the Q and B. Right, Valerie, what is the one action you want to see today?
We have to take yes for an answer. We are not the underdog anymore. We've never lived in a moment like today where the authorizing environment is on our side. There's never been higher political will, there's never been more financial interest, and there's never been more scientific certainty. So we have to stop talking about the why. Everybody gets it. Let's take yes for an answer and focus on the how-to and answering those questions. So in 50 years, when some of us older folks are retired, we're going to be invited back to talk about how it happened.
Okay, and Brian?
I'm trying to follow up what was been said. I'm struggling to see what hadn't been said, so I might just paraphrase. I think we need to showcase that biodiversity is the key foundation of everything that we do. So when we have discussions about different policies, we talked about energy, agriculture, what's the biodiversity? Let's bring it onto the table at the very start, have that conversation and say, well, how does it impact? What can we live with? What can we not? Instead of having biodiversity, as Valerie was saying, it's somewhere down the ground somewhere, it's a yes. Everyone realizes it's important. Let's just hammer home that message. It is critical. It's not important. It is the fundamental. And let's build from there as you don't go into a discussion with someone saying, oh, I don't know if I can do something, saying, yes, I can, and then move on from there.
It's Federling.
Indeed. Let's not ask me any more Irish after that.
Okay. So on that inspiring note, first of all, can I ask you all to put your hands together for Donal, for Valerie, for Mark?